Steven Jaffe and all listeners and viewers. My name is Lill Fanny Saether and I live in Oslo, Norway, in County Clare, where I am at the moment. It's an honor to be asked by PRONI to speak in connection to this very special event commemorating the Holocaust. Is it now an echo? Oh, boy. Are you all hearing an echo now? Or is it just me?
You're okay now, Lill.
Okay. I have been visiting PRONI and found information about the family in the archives. In addition, good contacts in Belfast, especially Steven Jaffe and Nigel Neville and Nigel Henderson, have contributed with valuable information. Thank you very much. The time frame for this event only allows a brief review of my mother's life. We started in Newry in 1909 and ended in Oslo in 1998. It was an adventurous journey with extraordinary things happening to her because she was Jewish, because she was a warm, caring and conscious woman who took upon herself heavy responsibility when it was required. My mother did not only survive the Holocaust, she also saved several other people's lives. I will concentrate this talk on the Irish connection and the events of the war. But first, a few words about the family background. My Jewish maternal great-grandparents, Abraham Simon and Rhoda Jette Freeman, came from a shtetl in Kaunas in Lithuania in the then Russia. They immigrated with 9 children by ship to Northern Ireland around 1890. The reason for this brave and daring decision was the anti-Semitism and persecutions and pogroms that the Jews experienced in the Russian Empire. They had to live in designated areas, pales of settlements, and in some of the settlements they were confined to the smaller shtetls. That is the villages and shtetls in Yiddish. In addition, Jews could, for instance, not choose certain educations or professions, and the young Jewish boys had to serve many more years military service than the rest of the population. The pogroms were violent anti-Jewish riots aimed at harassing and killing the Jews and burning down their dwellings. My grandmother, Florence, called Flory, was born in 1883 in a Palo settlement in the shtetl, Salantai in Lithuania on the border to today's Latvia. When leaving Russia, Abraham Simon and Rhoda Jette were aiming for America, like many immigrants from Eastern Europe those days, but instead they ended up in Newry. They were made to believe they had arrived in New York, being victims of fraud by the captain on the ship that brought them, thus him saving time and money. The immigrants would not know what neither of the cities looked like, and they did not speak or read English, knowing only Russian and Yiddish. I visited my mother's cousin, Abraham Freeman, in Belfast several times before he died some years back. Both he and some of his Jewish friends spoke of the same fraud, being the reason why they ended up in Belfast. But the Freemans were lucky. Upon their arrival in Newry, they were taken care of and welcomed by John Stokes and his family. John Stokes was a linguist and a consul general for several countries. He helped everyone who could not speak English with housing and other practical matters during the first few months. I've actually met John Stokes' grandson, David Rice, who lives here in Killaloe, and I've had email contact with Leonard Abrahamson, whose family was helped by John Stokes when they arrived in Newry. Abraham and Rhoda Jette settled in Cecil Street in Newry and had one more child after arriving. And here they are some years later. They seemed to be doing good. My grandmother was 7 years old when the family arrived in Newry. In PRONI, I found that she went to Ballybot National School for 5 years from January 1891. Ballybot was a school open to all faiths, unlike many schools in Northern Ireland. In the school protocol, it is noted that Florrie was never at national school, but she might have been going to school in Lithuania, or she might not. In many shtetls, only boys went to school. This was shortly after their arrival in Newry, and Florrie might not have mastered the language very well. In spite of this, she did well in school. Abraham's occupation is also noted in the school protocol, and he was a traveler, meaning he was earning his living as a traveling salesman like many Jews did. It was one of the few occupations open to them in Russia and very easy to pick up anywhere. 4 of Florrie's brothers also went to Ballybot. Abraham became a British citizen in March 1903. Rhoda Yetta and 7 of their children also became British subjects, including Florrie. At this time, the family was living in Mill Street. In 1906, Abraham worked as a draper, and he is registered in Cecil Street as a dealer, probably in fabric. Florrie married my grandfather, Joseph Mendel, in Newry in 1906. He was born in Libau, today's Liepaja in Latvia, and he grew up in Manchester after his father emigrated to UK a few years later than the Freemans. Florrie and Joseph got married in the family Freeman's home in Mill Street and settled in Kilmorey Terrace. Joseph earned a living as a credit traveling salesman. 3 of their children were born in Newry: Abraham in 1908, my mother Elsie in August 1909, and Sadie Miriam in 1911. My grandfather became British citizen in January 1911, as did the 3 children. The year after Florrie and Joseph got married in 1907, Abraham Simon died, and at this point, Rhoda Yetta moved with the youngest son to Belfast, where she died in 1937. The family Mendel left Newry for Norway in August 1911. They went to Norway because Joseph's sister and her husband, who had immigrated to Norway in 1905, wrote letters to the family members telling them of the good prospects in Norway. The move to Norway sealed the family's fate in 1942. After approximately a year in Oslo, called Christiania at the time, the family settled in the Norwegian town of Trondheim, where my grandfather opened the shop, selling mercery and general goods. The 2 youngest children were born in Trondheim, Esther in 1914 and Harry Isidor in 1918. And here they are, except Harry Isidor was not yet born, and Elsie, my mother, to the right in the first photo and to the left in the second. My mother spent her childhood and all her school years in Trondheim. She got a good education for her time, especially for women of her time. After primary and secondary school, she graduated from Commerce High School. During the First World War, 1914 to 18, 3 of Florrie's brothers enlisted as soldiers: Joseph, Louis, and Isaac Michael Freeman, as documented in the Belfast Daily Telegraph. Louis got a lifetime disability in 1914, and Isaac Michael, to the left, was killed in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Around 1920, Rhoda Yetta came from Belfast to Trondheim to live with the family for a while. She was receiving a pension from the army for the loss of her son, and she reported her movements there to the army authorities in Britain regarding her pension payments. Louis also came to Trondheim around the same time, probably escorting his mother, and he was also helping in the shop. So here are my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my mother's 2 youngest siblings that were born in Trondheim. But in 1922, my grandfather was bankrupt, leaving the family in a quite poor state for some years. They left Trondheim in 1928 and were living in 4 different places in southeast Norway before settling in Oslo in 1938. Here my grandfather took up his old trade as a traveling salesman, and that would be his profession the rest of his life. My mother's oldest brother, Abraham Simon, immigrated to USA in the 1930s. So now we have to have a very short review of the development in Germany during the 1930s. From what the Germans perceived as an unfair armistice in 1918 and the Versailles Treaty of 1919 and the Great Depression, the Nazi Party rose rapidly from obscurity to becoming the largest party in the German parliament in 1932. Hitler and other Nazi propagandists directed the people's anger and fear against those they held responsible, the Jews, the communists, and the Social Democrats. Hitler was appointed as Chancellor in January 1933, which paved the way to Nazi dictatorship. The Nuremberg laws of September 1935 were anti-Semitic and racist. There were 2 laws. Firstly, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor forbade marriages between Jews and Germans. And secondly, the citizenship law, which declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens, excluding the Jews, among others. The Jews living in Germany lost their citizenship. The Nuremberg meeting also determined a detailed racial classification system that decided who was considered Jewish. And you can't see it very well, but it was if you had 4, 3, 2, or none Jewish grandparents. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, thus starting the Second World War, the Jews in Poland were singled out. They had to carry armlets with the Star of David, and they were forced to live in designated areas. Joseph and Florrie had become Norwegian citizens in 1937. The 2 sisters, Elsie and Sadie Miriam, my mother standing and Sadie Miriam to the left on the chair, kept their British citizenship. This should prove to be a stroke of luck. The 2 youngest, born in Norway, on the other hand, became Norwegian citizens. The Norwegian citizenship would not protect them against racial persecution, while the British, on the other hand, should prove to be. I have quite a lot of knowledge and information about what happened to the family during the Nazi occupation of Norway from April 9, 1940 to May 8, 1945. My mother did convey some incidents, and my grandmother's diary that I found a while back delivers a substantial account of what happened to the family in October and November 1942 during the persecution, arrests, and deportation of the Jews in Norway. Norway's National Archives also holds a lot of information. German forces invaded Norway in spite of it declaring neutrality. The armed resistance ended in June 1940, and from then Nazi Germany controlled Norway and ruled by dictatorship. From February 1942, in collaboration with the Norwegian Nazi Party, which was the only legal party, under its leader Vidkun Quisling. The Norwegian King Haakon VII and the pre-war government escaped to London, where they acted as a government in exile during the whole war. After the occupation, horrific prison camps were introduced. There were comprehensive censorship, and there were also quickly a lack of food, and most goods were rationed over the course of the war. There were long queues in front of the shops to get hold of the few goods available, and people had to be inventive and finding substitutes for most groceries and other goods. And my mother told me she had a dress she had sewed of an old curtain. During the German occupation, many Norwegians were subject to persecution arrest, torture, executions for resisting the occupation and the Nazi rule, or for doing or saying anything the Nazis found offensive. But there were also quite a few Norwegians within the police and judiciary who collaborated with the Germans. The Norwegian Nazi Party gained a lot of new members, like in Germany. The Jews in Norway were early subject to special provisions. The radios were confiscated 1 year prior to the rest of the population, and there were random arrests of Jewish men, including refugees from European Nazi-occupied countries. Some were let out again, but some remained in captivity. After Quisling's inauguration in February 1942, all Jews had to meet up at the local police station to have their ID card stamped with a J. They also had to fill a 4-page form with all kinds of personal information, including birthplace, citizenship, and information about their property and financial status. In addition, whether they had been charged or convicted of any criminal offense. None of the members of the Mendel family had been charged or convicted. The Jews must have asked each other, what do the Nazis need this for? People knew to a certain degree what was going on in Nazi-occupied Europe, and that Jews in Germany, Poland, and France were deported to so-called labor camps. The Norwegian population obtained uncensored news through 2 channels. The government in exile transmitted radio broadcasts from BBC every evening. They were forbidden to listen to, but people did anyway. And there were many illegal newspapers being distributed, but neither did convey the whole truth, of course. Why didn't the Jews try to escape in time? A few had already fled to neutral Sweden or to UK via the Shetland Islands, but the journey was strenuous and dangerous. And in addition, there was death penalty for Jews who were captured while trying to flee, and for those assisting them. Many had also built their lives in Norway from nothing after escaping Tsarist Russia. They had children, elderly or sick relatives holding them back. They also had a naive faith in the Norwegian democracy and the Norwegian legal system. But neither was as they had known them anymore. And anyhow, who could have imagined what was awaiting them? Here are a few pages from my grandmother's diary documenting the events of autumn 1942. The real persecution started by the arrest of all Jewish men in October 26, 1942, and heavily assisted by Norwegian bureaucracy and police force. My mother's youngest brother, Harry Isidore, was arrested the next day, and he was held in prison until November 26th. My grandfather was nearly operated for hernia in Norway's largest hospital. At that time, my mother was employed in a shop belonging to a Jewish man. She warned him in the morning after the arrests. He came into the shop and she said, "Get out of here, find somewhere to hide. They're arresting the men." And as the owner turned round and stepped out of the shop, the police came in looking for him. My mother kept her calm, though her knees were shaking. On the question, "Who was that?" she replied, "I don't know, a customer." They asked if she knew where the owner was, and she said calmly, "No, I haven't seen him today." He saved his life and escaped to Sweden with his family at the beginning of December. After the men were imprisoned, it was unthinkable for women to try and escape, leaving them behind. And they couldn't imagine that the Nazis would do women and children any harm. But they would. When the Nazis and the Norwegian police came to arrest the women and children in the morning of November 26th, the 4 women in the family Mendel were home. My mother told me many times, as documented in Grandma's diary, how she said to the policeman, "My sister Sadie Miriam and myself are British subjects, so you cannot arrest us." My mother knew that some nationalities were exempt from the arrest order, issued the day before, among them Jewish citizens of USA and UK, and a few other countries, and Germany's allies. So due to their British citizenship, my mother and her sister were not detained. Neither was my grandmother, her husband being terminally ill in hospital. The police agreed to wait for 2 weeks with the deportation of my grandmother and grandfather until my grandfather had recovered or had died. To make sure she would not flee, my grandmother was ordered to report to the local police station every day. At this time, my grandfather was not that ill anymore. He was in fact in hiding in the hospital. Many of the staff in Norway's hospitals did a tremendous job hiding Jews and thus saving their lives. So the 3 women were left, but the Nazis took the youngest sister Esther with them. This day, the prison ship MS Donau was waiting by one of Oslo's quays. The women and children arrested were transported there from all over Oslo, and the men arrested in October, among them Harry Isidor, arrived from different prisons and camps. There was chaos, despair, and fear on the quay. The screaming children and women begging for mercy. To no avail. They were forced, women and men separate, by aggressive commands, kicks and blows on board the ship, and down on the deck into 2 separate cargo holds. The ship left Oslo at 14:55 on the 26th of October. My mother's 2 youngest siblings were 2 of 532 people, 302 men, 188 women, and 42 children on board. The youngest was 4 months, the oldest 80 years old. The journey took 4 days in horrendous weather. When arriving the Polish town of Stettin, they were loaded onto trains in cattle carts under massive harassment. They were standing so tight they could not sit down. No food or drink were offered. On the arrival to Auschwitz, December 1st, both my mother's siblings were brought directly to the gas chamber together with the other women and children. My grandmother described the heartbreaking farewells in her diary. During the rest of the war, she never gave up hope to see her children again. She mentions it frequently in her letters to the family in Ireland, England, and America. In total, the German and Norwegian Nazis deported 776 Jews from Norway during the Second World War. This was 53% of the registered Jews in the country. Only 32 men survived the ordeal and returned to Norway after the war. In addition to the Jews, thousands of Romani, disabled people, and homosexuals were deported and many were murdered. In the middle of the night on December 8, my mother rescued her father and another Jewish man from the hospital. It was extremely dangerous. Remember the death penalty. There was a curfew and blackout enforced, especially strict in the towns. So it was pitch dark when my mother sneaked through a hole in the fence surrounding the hospital and walked carrying a suitcase across an icy and slippery lawn towards the cellar door. She knocked, the door opened, and it was dark. She had to step into the darkness without seeing anything. When the door closed behind her, a nurse took a torch and led her up some stairs and into a room where my grandfather and the other man were waiting. In the suitcase, she had clothes for the 2 men, because Jews were not allowed to keep their clothes available while admitted, to prevent them from fleeing, of course. After the men had dressed, the 3 of them went back the same way, down the stairs and into the dark, the door closing behind them. Outside the fence, they were picked up by good Norwegians with cars, who, at a great risk, took them to different houses in town where they went into hiding. as did my grandmother and my mother's sister. There were quite a lot of Norwegians engaged in hiding Jews and transporting them out of the country. Many of those heroes were women, and it was my mother who contacted the rescuers and arranged the escape for her family. They stayed in hiding for 1 week until the night of December 15th and 16th when they escaped to Sweden. There were several escape organizations helping people to flee, first and foremost to Sweden. The people in these organizations were real, true heroes. It was, as I said earlier, death penalty for helping people fleeing, especially Jews. The leader of the organization helping my family was a former police officer who was expelled when he rejected saluting the Nazi way. After being expelled, he was working in a transport company, thus having access to vehicles. In addition, he was from the border region and he knew all the back roads to Sweden. He spoke fluent German and managed to talk them out of the many checkpoints and patrols along the road, and in addition there were people posted along the road warning them. The journey to the border took about 4 hours. It was icy and snowing on the roads, and the lorries were old, only with worn summer tires. They were running on wooden pellets as petrol was scarce. The lorries were holding approximately 20 refugees hiding under the canopies behind sacks of pellets or potatoes. They had to sit completely still and not make a sound. The children were giving sleeping tablets, not risking that they would start crying. It was freezing cold, hazardous, nerve-wracking, and an enormous physical strain on the refugees. They were let off quite close to the border, and then they had to walk in total silence through the forest, in dark, on a snow-filled and icy path. They were holding on to and helping each other as best they could. My mother told me she was carrying a child whose mother had 2 children and could only carry one. When they came across the border, they were met by Swedish border police and they were brought indoors. They had warm clothes, so they were served hot chocolate and food they had not had for more than 2 years. This particular organization rescued more than 1,000 people during the autumn and winter of 1942 to 43, until the members themselves had to flee as their activity had been tracked down by the Nazis. But one of the rescuers were later captured and executed. I have visited the Norwegian National Archives several times and found a lot of documents on the family. Among them, how the Norwegian Nazis robbed their apartment for furniture and other belongings. After having registered it, they sold most of it at auctions. Except furniture belonging to my mother and what the family had been able to salvage before fleeing. A faithful long-term lodger, Henning Kleven, rescued their most valuable belongings, my grandmother's jewelry and photos and documents. Without him, this story might never have been told. And I have many letters, especially letters from my grandmother and my mother, after my mother traveled by air, as one of very few, from Sweden to Scotland in April 1943. She'd got a position at the Norwegian consulate in Glasgow. I also have some letters my grandmother wrote to my mother after the liberation in May 1945, when they had returned to Norway. Their homecoming in July 1945, especially how they were searching for their belongings and their heartbreaking efforts to get compensation for losing their 2 children, is documented in the Norwegian National Archives. My mother did not come back to Norway until October 45, after the consulate had closed down. My mother saved her life because she was a British citizen, because she was knowledgeable and extremely responsible and brave, and because some Norwegians were unbelievably heroic and risked their own lives to save others. And finally, because Sweden was neutral and at least from the autumn 1942 received refugees from Norway unconditionally, including Jews. It is important to commemorate the Holocaust, to make sure that it is never forgotten and that it will never happen again. Those denying the Holocaust must not gain ground. And since most of the contemporary witnesses now are dead, those of us who were told of the events and can document them should convey this as loud and often as we can. Here are Esther and Isidore and the tumbling stones in the pavement outside their home in Oslo to remember them and to commemorate what happened to them during the Holocaust. How do we prevent such a genocide from happening again? We have to look at our own time and discover current phenomenon of the same kind as during the prelude to and during the Second World War. For instance, increasing prejudice, discrimination, hate, racism due to religion, color, ethnicity, sexual preference, or other reasons. We must speak up against people being prejudged and persecuted and killed for what they are. Black lives matter, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian lives matter, all lives matter. Thanks again to PRONI, Stephen Scott, and to Lindsay Gillespie for running the slideshow. And thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much. My name is Steven Jaffe. I just want to say at this stage, thank you again to the Public Record Office, not just for this evening's event, but you've been putting on excellent events to mark Holocaust Memorial Day for a number of years, and that's very much appreciated by the Jewish community in Northern Ireland and much wider as well. And certainly a big thank you to Lindsay for making sure everything ran smoothly this evening, and to Stephen for introducing. I want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening to show Lill the interest which I know there is in this story. I think the very fact that it extends from Newry to Auschwitz is an important lesson to all of us, that events that sometimes we think took place far away involving other people actually is much closer to home than what we may think. And I know, Lill, it must be quite an emotional story for you to tell. It's certainly a very personal and family story. And I think all of us will want to say thank you this evening to you for sharing it with us, for appreciating its educational value, its ability to engage. And I know that you're very willing to speak to other audiences, to in particular younger people who are perhaps not so familiar. It is an incredible story, as you mentioned it, of collaborators, of bystanders, of heroic people who were prepared to risk their own lives.